One of the things that has stopped just like that during COVID, and we are still paying the consequences for in lots and lots of ways, were overseas visitors to this country. It wasn't just that overseas visitors were important to us in terms of their revenue. In fact, I think tourism and dairying sort of vie with each other to be which is the more were vying with each other to be which is the more important export industry to New Zealand, and is so critical to our GDP and our economic health and prosperity in this country, tourism and dairying. But also we lost a whole series of people who were coming into this country who we relied upon to staff the tourism industry, to work in the hospo industry, the hospitality industry, but also in shops and tourism shops and the like, in retail. And as we've discovered, those international visitors have also been critical in working in places like farms, horticulture, viticulture, a whole series of places where we can afford to put people on the dole somewhere, but we can't afford to get them to make them to work, so international visitors help us out. Well, as a consequence of that, New Zealand's economy in some areas has suffered over the last 3 years. You'd have to say, and I remember living in the heart of one of those tourism industries in the Central Lakes area of New Zealand, or the Southern Lakes area of New Zealand, that tourists are back in large numbers, huge numbers in actual fact, particularly domestic tourists I've noticed travelling more, it would seem. But also the Australians are back. We're starting to find the Germans and the Europeans are back as well. And the Chinese haven't even arrived in any great numbers yet. The Chinese bus tour that used to be a staple of the industry, certainly in the southern part of the country, hasn't come back with anywhere near the ferocity that was existing 3 years ago. So one would imagine that even those numbers are going to pick up and going to make a difference. Yes, but there's a problem. The problem is we actually can't service the tourism industry at the moment. We simply don't have the people. And even a year ago, that was hilarious. I went to go and take my son into Queenstown, wanted to take him to the McDonald's, and we couldn't get a McDonald's hamburger because it was shut because they couldn't have staff. My daughter, who works in the hospitality industry, she's having a gap year in between the last year of school and going off, we hope, to university. God, you're never sure these days if university is a good option or not, to be honest with you. But she's been paid an astronomical sum of money to work in the hospitality industry because, and my other daughter, who does work in the wine industry, and she's in year 12 on a holiday job, she gets paid an astronomical amount of hourly work to do so as well, because basically workers are as scarce as hen's teeth and they're getting well for it. But tourism is an issue that is not going to go away. It's still considered fundamental to large numbers of the economies of New Zealand and into New Zealand's prosperity as well. After the cyclonic event of Gabriel, money's become even more important to our government. We've gone through COVID, bailing out ourselves through, I would suggest to you, an overreaction to the COVID crisis. But now we're starting to get climate mitigation issues. We've got a cyclonic, obviously, disaster to deal with. And we're going to need money to pay for all these things. The tourism industry, you would think, is critical to that, and the taxation revenue that it generates, both in terms of business and commercial tax, and personal tax as well. Now, one of the people that has been prominent in looking at the tourism industry for a long time has been a professor from the Otago Tourism Policy School, Professor James Higham, who's the co-director there. Professor Higham also has a different, or another sort of, if you like, political wing to his bow. He's one of a group of people who call themselves informed leaders. Actually, I've just noticed the spelling area there. I must take that up with James. Informed leaders who are suggesting that we don't need any more airports in this country. And in particular, and we've talked about this before on the show. In fact, I think we talked to Michael Singleton at the end of last year. In particular, one of the things they are opposed to is Christchurch Airport building a new international airport in the Terrace. And for those of you who don't know where the Terrace is, it's sort of in between Cromwell and Wanaka. Not on a direct route, but it's about 30 kilometres, where would it be? Is it north of Cromwell? And it's about 25 kilometres from Wanaka. And that's one of its great attractions. Not only is it flat farmland, but it also is very, very close to the ski fields, to the tourism hotspots of central Otago and the Southern Lakes. And Queenstown Airport is at capacity. Joining us to talk about this, both the future of tourism, but also in this desire to stop this new airport, is Professor Higham, the co-director of the Tourism School at Otago University. Professor Higham, welcome to the show. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Couple of things. The informed leaders, the last email that went out last Wednesday, James, you're one of that group. You've sent it out to me as a Central Otago as Otago Regional Council. You've sent it from the Prime Minister all around the show. It is public. The proposed international jet airports at Terrace. Now, you sent a letter earlier, I think, was at the end of last year, suggesting that the airport should not be built. Why?
Well, the gist of the letter and the Informed Leaders Initiative is one that tries to highlight the research that we think should inform discussion and debate around the matter of the new airport proposal for Terrace. So what we're trying to do is raise public awareness, but particularly raise awareness with the decision makers for a proposal like this, hence informed leaders. We're not claiming ourselves to be informed leaders. We're urging decision-making leaders to be informed by the research that may be very relevant to these sorts of decisions. So that's the basis of the correspondence. Hello?
Sorry, James, I didn't turn on my mic. My apologies. It seems to me, having read the letter... That's all right. I'm back now. Having read the letter, though, It seems to me odd that you are a professor of tourism, but you seem to be anti-tourism, if you don't mind me saying so, looking at the letter. Can I read you a particular quote? Global aviation growth continues to fuel growth in harmful emissions, as it has for many decades, and is forecast to continue to do so over the coming decades. A new international airport undeniably, underlined, invites more growth. Are you opposed to tourism growth to New Zealand?
Well, we're in a rebuild phase at the moment, as you mentioned in your lengthy introduction. So we are in a growth phase now. Prior to COVID, throughout the 2010s, and basically post-dating the global financial crisis, when our Prime Minister, John Key, was also the Minister for Tourism, we saw enormous growth across that decade. And that was obviously a hugely important decade for New Zealand tourism. As you mentioned, tourism is very, very important to our economy. But by the end of the 2010s, and on the eve of COVID, we had reached a really critical point in tourism, at which it was becoming increasingly problematic for many people in many tourism communities and local communities that had received this rapid increase in visitor arrivals into their communities during this time. But the so-called social license for tourism, the acceptance and the warm welcome of Kiwis in those communities was becoming rather exhausted, and people were becoming a bit jaded and a bit tired of having so many transient people, tourists, moving through their communities and in many ways using infrastructures that were running behind the growth curve. So people's lives, lifestyles, ways of living, daily routines were being increasingly compromised by tourism. And this was captured by a report published in December 2019 by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, who said we really need to rethink how we manage tourism in this country, because we need to make sure that tourism, A, doesn't exhaust the environmental resources that are fundamental to visitor experiences, but also that it doesn't exhaust social license and exhaust the welcome of Kiwis that is obviously so important to tourism. So the COVID interruption has provided quite a timely window for us to reflect upon tourism and reflect upon what might be in the best interests of tourism for the New Zealand economy in the rebuild and reset for the future.
Can I just say, that seems incredibly and middle class and out of touch, that view, James. And can I put it to you as somebody who lives in a tourism area? You don't live here. And certainly Simon Upton, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, doesn't live here. You're both well-heeled and educated and literate and Simon Upton's case, well paid, I'm sure. But for us who live here, tourism is our bread and butter. It is what makes us live here and prosper. We were irritated by the fact that authorities were letting us down in terms, for example, like freedom camping and things like that they weren't bringing in the regulations. But we weren't trying to stop the number of tourists coming in here. They are the reason why our economy works. Don't you think?
No, I completely and utterly disagree. These reports that have been produced based on insights and investigation. I don't know who you're speaking on behalf of when you say us and we.
Well, just about everybody who lives here.
You can't be talking about everyone who lives there because that's contradictory to the well-reported social sentiments that have been identified, for example, by the tourism industry Aotearoa, the National Tourism Industry Association.
Then they clearly don't know what they're talking about. Can I just say, Professor Higham, every one of us who lives in Central, or most of us who live in Central Otago and the lakes, we are migrants. We came here to live here because we like the lifestyle. But we are coming in droves and tens of thousands. This is one of the largest growing areas in New Zealand. And tourism is in part responsible for that. It provides us with jobs. It provides us with security. It provides us with, if you like, a degree of security that we don't see and a lifestyle that we don't see anywhere else. So, I mean, we wouldn't be here unless there were jobs. And so we don't find tourism as a negative factor. We just want to make sure that some of the peripheral stuff, and freedom camping is a really good example of that, is managed appropriately. But at no stage do we not want people to come here.
So on what grounds do you discredit tourism industry Aotearoa's
listen, because they haven't talked to us. I'm an elected member of the Otago Regional Council. I'm in the Dunstan ward. I've lived here for the last, almost the last decade. I'm an elected representative of the people of the communities that I service. Queenstown, Wanaka, Alexandra, Cromwell, Central Otago and the Maniatoto. Tourism industry is regarded as vital to our economies and to the people who live here. And most of us who've come to this area are migrants. We weren't born and raised here. We came here for that lifestyle, but also many of us brought the industries that service the tourism industry in general. I mean, you're talking like we want to blow up the bridges somewhere and stop people coming in here. Now, that might suit the Brian Turners and the greenie environmentalists, but that's not ordinary people who live in the Central Otago Lakes.
So what's your question? I mean, I can share with you insights from the likes of the Parliamentary Commissioner and Tourism Industry Aotearoa, which
I'm sorry, if Simon Upton's your authority... Richard, listen, I'm sorry, but if Simon Upton's your authority, that's no authority at all. Simon's a bureaucrat living, I know him, served in Parliament with him. I know how Simon thinks. He thinks at a stratospheric level. But he would no more understand the workers, the tradies, the business owners and the hospitality fraternity of Central Otago Lakes than, to be honest with you, he would be able to nail a nail in a piece of wood. I mean, it's just not Simon's malure. So for him to be quoted as authority for what we think when he doesn't even live here is a bit rich, don't you think?
No, I don't think it's rich at all. I think it's very useful. I think it's data-driven. I know that the TIA conduct their investigations in social sentiments in communities across the country, track it using rigorous methods, and identify growing social sentiments that want tourism to be carefully managed rather than left to free rein growth that is environmentally and socially unsustainable. So no, I think I'm happy to disagree with you on all of those points.
How is okay? So you want to stop people flying? Listen, at the end of the day, isn't your aim overtly?
Sorry, you're misrepresenting me completely there. I'm not saying that at all. I've said exactly the opposite of that.
That's not what this letter says. I quoted out exactly what this letter says. You are suggesting that any future global aviation.
I've said publicly that flying will always be very important to a geographically far-flung country like Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm not saying that people should stop flying. I'm saying we do need to change the way we fly, because flying comes with very high environmental costs. And so we do need to rethink the way we fly, but I'm not saying that we should stop flying.
Okay, let's talk about the way we fly then.
Sure.
This letter also suggests that new technology will not solve the problem, whether it's of hydrogen or electric planes in the future.
Yes.
But doesn't it appear sophistry to me? If new technology is not going to solve the problem and you're not opposed to flying, don't you need to restrict the number of people who do fly into this country to meet the requests of the informed leaders? And one of them is obviously to stop a new airport at Terrace. But you've also surely got to restrict the number of people who are flying on planes into this country, don't you?
Well, at the moment, global tourism is very, very dependent on aero mobility, on air travel. And one of the things that we've seen over the decades to date is the acceleration of tourism, such that people tend to travel more frequently, further distances, for shorter durations, typically therefore spending less at the destination with a very, very high carbon footprint and therefore high environmental costs. And airlines have perpetuated this in the way they advertise and the way they promote cheap tickets and such like. But this is very, very different to the way we've travelled in the past. And we're going to have to travel differently again in the future because of the very high environmental costs of this model of tourism. If we could arrive at a model in future where we perhaps have slightly fewer rather than slightly more tourists, but staying here longer, exactly the sorts of tourists that you mentioned in your introduction, tourists who might be here for weeks or months rather than days, tourists who might help with workforce issues, working in the various sectors that you mentioned in your introduction. This is going to be a far more economically beneficial model for tourism, but it'll also allow us to try and decarbonise the carbon footprint of every dollar of tourism spending that contributes to GDP. And that is the sort of model that many are now talking about in terms of trying to confront the enormous challenges that we face being an international tourism destination at the opposite end of the world to most of our markets.
Well, but that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Well, our geographical location. You can only really reach us by air travel. That's part of the problem. Well, it's an insoluble problem. I mean, people aren't going to travel on a boat to get here, which is the only alternative way that they might make that happen. So they are going to have to fly into our country.
But that's not entirely right.
Well, that's true, but they are usually of a certain type, those sort of people, and the cruise ship industry is important to this country, no question about that. But even then, you talk about social license. Well, look, you're in Dunedin. Look at how the locals think about the effect, ironically, or some of the locals think about the effect that cruise ships have upon you and your quality of life as a consequence. And yet we know that they're critical to the Dunedin economy. and becoming more so. But can I ask you this, though? If you're not going to fly here in the numbers that you are now to create the jobs and the income that you do and the wealth that flows into our economy, how are you going to get here? I mean, you talk about trying to change the way of tourists. Listen, as you know, many of our tourists are people who simply fly in for the weekend from Australia, particularly to the Queenstown and Lakes area. They come and have a long weekend here and it's a good time, and then they go home again. Do we want to stop that?
Well, we've got to think about the enormous challenges, but also the enormous opportunities that are available and that confront tourism. We're at a real crossroads currently, Michael. We've got an amazing set of challenges and opportunities in front of us, and we need to really think very, very carefully about the future of tourism and the sort of tourism that might be most beneficial to New Zealand in terms of the economy, but also in terms of protecting and enhancing our environments and protecting the interests of people within the communities that tourists visit. Enormous challenges, enormous opportunities. It's a very interesting time to be debating these very issues.
Okay. The problem is, see, you and I have a fundamentally and diametrically different view on tourism, which is fair enough. I mean, you're allowed to have that. We both are. But the problem is that we've got a government, well, not a problem, but I mean, it's just the fundamental reality that we've got an economy that is based upon, I won't say mass tourism, but is getting as many people into this country as possible. And therefore creating the jobs, the economic growth, and particularly the income tax and the GST for the government to spend on other things. How do you find an alternative that's realistic to bringing people here for this outside of the model that you've got at the moment?
That's a really, really good question. How do we shift the dial? How do we create coordination within such a disparate sector? One of the challenges of tourism historically is that it's very hard to coordinate. It's hard to rein in. It's hard to manage. It's hard to direct. And the main reason for that is that it is such a disparate sector. Many of the key players in tourism don't even realize that, or don't even think of themselves as being within tourism. For example, supermarkets and petrol stations and other local providers. It's such a difficult sector to actually define, to pin down, to demarcate and to manage. But the Tourism Policy School that I co-direct, now in its fifth year, has been quite an eye-opening experience for me, because the philosophy of the policy school is to bring together very diverse audiences that don't often speak to each other. So I'm talking not only about key tourism organisations, such as the Tourism Board, TIA, Tourism Industry Aotearoa, but also policymakers and business leaders and academics and local communities, to try and bring them together in the same room to discuss exactly these sorts of questions. And the reason I mention the Tourism Policy School now is because over the last 5 years, and particularly over the last 3 years, the COVID years, where there's been enormous concern about how heavily tourism has been impacted, how the workforce has been destroyed, how we're possibly going to start to rebuild a workforce in a sector that has such a bad reputation now for workforce, because it's so vulnerable to occasional crises such as COVID-19. One of the things that's emerged in the last 3 years is an unprecedented consensus amongst those very diverse audiences that we need to do things differently in the future compared to the past. It seems to me that what you're advocating very strongly is for a mass tourism sort of formula, and growth regardless of the wider consequences of growth. But the consensus that we've heard in the Tourism Policy School in recent years has been very much that we need to rethink and reset. And your question is a good one. How do we do that? Because tourism is a juggernaut. It's a little bit like turning around and redirecting an ocean-going cruise liner. It's not very easy. You can turn the rudder, but it takes a little bit of time for the bow to start turning, right? So we do have enormous challenges, and it's a very important question that you ask. How can we give some sort of national coordination to an industry that tends to play out more so at the regional and local level?
Yes, and the other thing is just as you were talking then, the thing that struck me were two things. The first thing is how many different players are in that market. I mean, that's so good luck on trying to get them all to work on to some sort of central planning idea. But the second one is...
Indeed.
And please forgive me for saying this, because you can say anything you like back at me. Professor, are you in actual fact open, though, to ideas that aren't your own? Like, when you talk about this tourism policy school and there's unprecedented consensus, for example, if you went to talk to the electricians, the tradesmen, the builders, the plumbers, the accommodation providers, the horticultural, the viticulturalists who are so dependent upon tourism here coming in, to all those people, and then the ancillaries like the restaurants and the cafes and the retail, etc., like that, who are dependent upon the tourism industry, they might have a pretty sharp reply when it comes to changing the model when it has such a ambiguous end, if you know what I mean.
Well, of course, yeah. And the short answer to your initial question is yes, I'm very, very open to discussion and debate, and very open to views that are different to my own personally. So, yeah, absolutely. I understand that, any such issues that when discussed and debated in the public domain will throw up contrasting points of view. But that should not stop us from trying to be very inclusive and open to discussion when it comes to the future of tourism.
Okay, well, I hope you then invite people like me to the next tourism policy school so that we can put a slightly alternative view, because I'm sure then we might get, I won't say a more balanced outcome, but at least everybody in the room will understand that if you just change this lever here, you destroy or particularly affect the lifestyle of somebody that's already here. I was just thinking of 100 plus wineries, James. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, and of course, wineries are critically important to tourism, and
they are
central, absolutely important to these debates. And the way you portray this as if I'm trying to destroy wineries or destroy the livelihoods of people is just. It's just absurd. I mean, it's completely outrageous. We have international visitors in different societies around the world that are becoming acutely concerned about climate change, and we are arguably the most vulnerable destination in the world to those sorts of social sentiments. If we want to face a future where people simply don't want to visit New Zealand because we're seen as a pariah in terms of our efforts to play our part in terms of the global climate crisis, then the people that you're talking about are going to benefit not in one bit whatsoever. So we need to really be open-minded about the challenges that we face. They also come with opportunities, because if we do a good job of addressing the future of tourism, and if we are able to demonstrate our commitments to these sorts of global crises in the way we manage tourism in the future, then that's going to be much more beneficial to everyone rather than not. So I think it's really important that we do have discussion about these sorts of issues, and we do so in a way that's inclusive.
Okay, but I'm going to say to you, if you're going to limit air travel to this country, and that's the only way to get to this sliver of the world, then you are going to clearly impact upon the number of tourists who come here and the economic product that they bring with them, yeah?
Well, not necessarily. And here's the thing. If you were to halve the number of visitors that came to this country, you would think that that's going to have the dire economic consequences that you're talking about. But if that reduced number of visitors stayed twice as long as the average now, we would still have the same volume of tourism as measured in visitor nights, for example. Fewer tourists staying longer is a model that would greatly reduce the carbon footprint per visitor, per dollar that they spend in the economy. And in fact, if we extend stay, we will, in fact, increase the economic benefits to this country, despite perhaps there being fewer visitors arriving here. And when you make generalizations, for example, about community sentiments and the way communities feel, for example, about cruise ships and the enormous economic importance of cruise passengers, in actual fact, the data is quite revealing here. In 2019, the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research reported on the economic contributions of different visitor types to our country, and you would have been very, very surprised by their findings. They found that cruise ship passengers who arrive here with this image of affluence and high visitor expenditure actually contribute far less than we might otherwise think to our economy. Cruise ship passengers are 9% of our total international visitor arrivals, but contribute only 3% of visitor spend. The most, believe it or not, the most important international visitors to our economy are students, international students, because they spend a semester or a year or up to 3 years, and in some cases 4 years here, and therefore their total visitor spend is far greater than cruise ship passengers. So these are the sorts of things that I think are very usefully informed by research insights from, for example, the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. And I think these are the sorts of research insights that should be informing leaders in their decision-making around the future of tourism. And that's the essence of the initiative and the correspondence that we're talking about today.
Okay, but if I'd also pull back, because I'm an Otago regional councillor, those cruise ships coming into the port of Otago provide a dividend to every Otago person. So because we make a profit, we're able to disperse that throughout the Otago economy as well. And the cruise ships make an awful lot of difference to the overall net profit of the port of Otago. Can I just finally pick you up on this one? Yep. And this is the last one, I'll let you go. 40% of international visitors to this country are Australians. They made up 1.5 million of the $3.9 million annual arrivals before COVID-19. They are clearly mostly short-term visitors. They come over here to ski for the weekend, or they come over here, as so many of them do, and I know meeting many of them, for a weekend at the wineries or just to get away. Queenstown's a favourite destination, so is Rotorua, Auckland, Wellington, etc. They might come for sporting events, or one-off sporting events like a Bledisloe Cup or similar. They are obviously short-term visitors. We don't really want to stop them coming, do we?
No, we don't. And here's the thing. When it comes to the carbon footprint of visitors in our communities, Australia is actually one of our lowest carbon sources of visitors because they're close by. They have about 14 or 15% the carbon footprint of a visitor from Europe. Naturally, this is because of distance and the high carbon emissions of air travel. During the COVID break, we've seen a very, very interesting evolution in New Zealand tourism, and that has been naturally because of border closures. Tourists from New Zealand travelling domestically within this country, and they have the lowest carbon footprint of all because they don't have to fly to arrive in this country because they're here already. And when you combine tourists from New Zealand not travelling overseas, outbound tourism, but spending more of their money in New Zealand travelling domestically, with Australian visitors, who you have correctly said are in a huge proportion of the international visitor spend in this country, domestic tourism and Australian tourism combined is actually the vast majority of tourists' expenditure in this country. And so you're absolutely right. Those two markets are crucially important. And one of the changes that we've seen with COVID has been that Tourism New Zealand, which formerly marketed only to international visitors to bring foreign exchange into this country, has now refocused to now also address domestic tourist motivations and to market to domestic visitors. And that is another really important insight into what the tourism reset should look like in this country, because domestic tourism is hugely important to the people that you've been speaking about in this interview.
I do understand that, but I do get the feeling that the reason that New Zealanders travelled internally was because you're dead right, the borders weren't open. There's only so many times you can come to Queenstown or go to Rotorua. No one would want to visit Wellington, for example. You go there just to be disappointed. So what I'm trying to say is that domestic tourism has a limited life. It's until those people have finished going to those destinations. Now, you're absolutely right. Domestic tourism is what saved tourism over the last 3 years. But I wonder as soon how long that will continue once you can now fly to Australia or to the islands or to, as my daughter is going off to Thailand or Bali this week, now that the floodgates are open again.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, travelling internationally is hugely important to New Zealanders. Young people, I have children of OE age myself, and nothing's going to stop them travelling overseas. And I'd be the last person to discourage that. Broadening horizons, etc. Wonderful. But I disagree. I disagree that domestic tourism will be a flash in the pan and people will soon reorientate and head off to the Pacific Islands and further afield. What we've seen with COVID is a rediscovery of our own backyard, with people visiting places that they'd never been to before. But you're right, coming to Queenstown and rediscovering places that were familiar from previous years. But I think it's been fascinating to see places, for example, like Gisborne. Gisborne benefited enormously from the COVID pause in terms of tourism, because New Zealanders were heading to places to explore parts of the country that they hadn't seen before. And I hope that will continue long into the future, because domestic tourism is really important. And we have an amazing tourism sector in this country, and we have wonderful experiences. And I very much hope that New Zealanders will continue to do exactly that and explore their own country.
Professor Higham, thank you very much for coming on the show. I've enjoyed debating with you, and I look forward to your continued contribution to the tourism industry. I hope that we can talk again soon, and I'd like to have a chat with you after the forum. That you've got the tourism policy school, next week or the week after?
Yeah, it's coming up. There's a public lecture on the 23rd of March, and the Tourism Policy School is on Friday, the 24th of March. So coming up soon.
Okay, I look forward to talking to you after that and see how it goes. The very best wishes to you. Thank you very much. That is Professor James Higham from his Professor of Tourism